Genealogy, like any other evidence-based pursuit, it has its potential hazards. And here I'm referring to errors in logic that occur when we attempt to analyze and interpret the evidence that we've collected. Faulty interpretation can lead to potential embarrassment when our errors are finally exposed by someone who doesn't accept our assumptions. Worse still, when no one ever questions our logic, we can end up in a position of blissful ignorance, from which we may never escape. Either we'll continue to pursue a family line that is not actually ours, or we may find the road ahead entirely blocked off because the facts do not support our assumptions. I don't know about you, but I have collected entire folders full of information on families that I thought were my ancestors, but later discovered that I had no connection to whatsoever. And if you haven't had that experience yet, you are either new to genealogy or your mind hasn't quite grasped your errors yet. Give it time. One big safeguard against error is trying to keep an open mind, even about questions that you believed either you or the authorities you've accepted as definitive had settled a long time ago. I like the pattern that the scientific method has given us. The pursuit of truth is endless because we never have absolute knowledge. This is as true of the past and the people who populated it as it is of the way in which the natural world and the universe work. We gather a lot of evidence from different sources, whether it is a land or a tax record, tombstone, vital record, old family letters, family histories, Bibles, or court papers. Hopefully, we know the difference between a reliable source and a questionable one. We store up that fund of evidence, adding to it constantly, and analyze and compare every bit to all the others over time. We look for patterns. We develop theories of how people relate to each other in that distant world that we are studying. Sometimes we have better documentation for our theories than we do at others. But particularly when the documents are not definitive, any theories that we develop need to be open to new evidence as it arises. New evidence will always put our theories to the test. That evidence can have a variety of impacts, everything from confirming our thinking to requiring a mild revision, or maybe a more drastic overhaul of our theory. It may be that we'll even have to discard the old theory entirely and create something new which better explains the evidence that we have. But each time, we get a little bit closer to a true picture of an ancestral family. Now, science has two means to guarantee accuracy. One is the testing and retesting of theories through new evidence and replication of experiments, and the other is peer review. Peer review occurs when other informed and skilled genealogists, in this case, are exposed to our conclusions and are able to critique them as needed. That might be through something that we publish about our families, a family tree online, let's say, or a website, or a conventional article or a book. Note that I said informed and skilled researchers. If 20 family trees online agree on a point of interest without documentation, that is not peer review. That's usually just plagiarism. So, do those skilled and informed others agree with us? Or do they provide us with valid points that we need to address? If they disagree, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're wrong. It simply means that we need to address the concerns they raise to our own satisfaction, while being entirely intellectually honest with ourselves. We shouldn't look upon our critics as adversaries, but as people who are trying to help us perfect our conclusions, whether that's actually true or not, because sometimes they are just trying to be adversarial. But one key problem with evidence-based inquiry is the intrusion of ego into that process. See, we're human beings, so once we adopt a conclusion, we are often loath to let it go, even when it's obvious that we're wrong. We don't want to look bad. We don't want to admit that we jumped to conclusions or took a shortcut. But if we don't let go of the falsehood, we can never embrace the truth and move forward. And chances are, in this digital era, will also lead others down the wrong path. I'm not saying that we can shut off our hurt feelings, but we have to be very aware of how letting them run away with us will affect our quest for knowledge. Now, every branch of human knowledge has its own particular challenges, and for genealogy, none is more important than the problem of identity. Now, what do I mean by that? Few of us have really considered how assumptions about identity can lead us astray. And ancient historians have faced this problem constantly. They're dealing with very distant times and spotty survival of evidence. How can they know for certain that a text or an inscription they've found refers to a well-known historical personage? Or on the other hand, maybe it refers to someone who just has the same name and lived at the same time, perhaps in the same location. Context often helps. For instance, when archaeologists in Israel found the Tel Dan inscription in 1993, which referred to the house of David, and were able to date it to the 9th century BC, they finally had extra biblical evidence that King David was a historical personage. They knew the inscription was authentic and that it referred to a royal dynasty because of the context. This was the memorial inscription of an Aramaean king's defeat of the king of Israel and the king of the house of David in battle. So, the Syrian king wasn't referring to the lineage of some average bloke named David. It was the real King David of the Bible. But the context is not always enough. Two or more average people living just a century or two ago may look very similar to one another when viewed from above, particularly if we don't look too deeply at the full corpus of surviving evidence. Consider, for example, the St. James ossuary, which, according to some scholars, may have held the bones of Jesus' brother, James the Just, the head of the early Christian church in Jerusalem. Now, this discovery created a great stir in 2002 when an antiquities collector brought it to light. The ossuary has an inscription that many judge to be authentic, identifying the occupant of this box to have been Yaakov, the son of Yosef, the brother of Yeshua. The carbon dating and the orthography place it in the 1st century CE. It is not normal to have an inscription on a tomb that mentions a brother in addition to a father. One would assume that that brother was very important. But it was questioned on many levels. After all three of these masculine names that are given in the inscription, they're very common among Jewish men in the 1st century, Yaakov being equivalent to James, Joseph to Joseph, and Yeshua to Jesus. The combination of the three, however, is much rarer, although how rare it would be is hard to determine because we don't have a thorough record of all the people who lived at that time, a census or something like that. Even assuming the entire inscription is period specific and authentic, there is no guarantee that the historical Jesus or his brother James are the persons referred to. Some claim that the Jesus part of the inscription was added later. Others, including the Israeli Antiquities Authority, judged that the entire inscription was a forgery. After all, if you think about it, a box like this is going to be very valuable to whoever owns it. Now, most of us would never assume that the St. James ossuary inscription was authentic offhand. We would defer to the experts and let them examine the evidence and deliver their reports. Since the reports remain inconclusive and authorities outside of Israel have never had a chance to examine the ossuary in full detail, we allow ourselves to remain in doubt. But when it comes to our families, we often succumb to the potentially false conclusion that a record that we have found in a certain location aligns with a particular ancestor in our family tree, i.e. that the person in the record, the person it's referring to, is identical to our ancestor. Consider a scenario like this. John Phillips, an ancestor, has a wife named Mary, There's no record of marriage for the two, but their first child was born about 1830. So we may assume that they were married about 1828 or 29. In 1843, Thomas Dolan left a will in the same county, which, along with other persons, mentions his daughter Mary Phillips and leaves her some property. The question is Mary, wife of John Phillips, and Thomas Dolan's daughter Mary the same person? Well, they have the same name, that's for sure. The fact is very much in favor of their being the same individual. But there is a lot of room to allow that they might not be. What other tests could we put this conclusion to? Well, we might ask, how close did John Phillips live to the Thomas Dolan family? Were they in the same neighborhood? Could they have known one another and interacted with one another? Can we find other wives of Phillips' men in the neighborhood, or who moved away from it, named Mary or Polly? If so, can their fathers be identified? If there are alternatives out there, we need to evaluate them as potentially being the person that we're dealing with rather than Thomas Dolan's daughter. What given names did John and Mary Phillips use in their family? Did those names align at all with Thomas Dolan's children, his parents, siblings, wife, or in-laws? What property did John and Mary Phillips have? Did any of it potentially come from Thomas Dolan? Now, if we could document that, if we could be clear about that, then we could make the connection very, very clearly. Because documenting property is one of the easiest ways to get those two into the same ballpark. Does Mary Phillips' age accord with daughters born to Thomas Dolan per earlier census entries? The Mary that we have in Thomas's family has to align with the Mary that we know was married to our Phillips ancestor. So a complete accounting of his daughters is in order that we can compare against those census entries in the pre-1850 censuses. Were the Dolan and John Phillips families united by other characteristics, say church membership, social and economic status, common interests or trades that would put them into the same social milieu? And do other records featuring John Phillips, like deeds or land grants, bonds, court documents, probate materials, promissory notes, involve Dolan family members? In-laws typically support one another, or they may indeed show signs of conflict with one another. If they don't seem to be interacting at all, positively or negatively, that could be a warning sign that we've taken a wrong turn and confused two people of the same name. Through this exercise, we can see that the pathway to proving identity is a challenging one. It involves looking at more than just one name in a couple of different records, in this case Dolan's will and maybe the Phillips census entry in 1850. It requires us to look at other people named Phillips in the community who may be rivals for identification with Dolan's daughter. It asks us to look for a pattern of association between the two families that is more than just a single moment in time, but which extends over years and decades. If the will had also mentioned Mary Dolan's husband by name, we might have a better case to rely on just the one document, assuming that there were no other John Phillipses with wives named Mary, Polly, or Molly, which are nicknames for Mary, who hailed from any other location where Thomas Dolan had lived. Identity, then, is far more than a name. We know that instinctively. Google your name online and discover just how many people in the world have either the same name exactly as you or a similar name, and who may even be similar in age. We must take a multi-dimensional approach to identity when dealing with ancestors. None of them are fully documented. In fact, many of them are quite poorly documented in public records. We can only see certain pieces of information about them at certain points in time, but unless their names are exceedingly rare, we cannot be sure we're dealing with the same person unless we look at multiple elements of identity. Identity is complex. Not all elements of it are going to be available to us as genealogists, but many can be. Elements of identity that we can employ to test our theories of people being the same as one another are age, profession, geographical locations, and I mean by that not just a particular county, but hopefully a community or a waterway, a captain's district, a tax district. Specificity is key. A timeline of known events about them. Known family members, for instance, the wife's name, the children's name, particularly. Social class, their community prominence. They're going to tend to interact with people of that same class. Their religious affiliation, which also kind of sets up parameters for how people interact with one another, in former times particularly. Their gender. Their racial designation, which can be subjective depending on who's looking and evaluating and determining what category they fall into. It's often imposed by authorities in the past, whether a person of color, for example, was perceived as white or black or something in between. Physical characteristics, if photos or descriptions of them are available. Signatures, which can be very unique to individuals and can be evaluated against one another. It's great to collect signatures of your ancestors to help prove their identities. And genetic information, clearly part of identity. So the point is, if you're trying to prove two people of the same name are identical, all of the elements that you know to be true about the known person must potentially fit with the characteristics and location of the other individual that you're seeking to identify with them. It's also important to look for and evaluate any potential rivals of the same name who may in fact be the person you're trying to incorporate into your research as your own ancestor when they are not. These rivals must be proven to be different people for you to be secure in your conclusion. That's part of the genealogical proof standard, to reconcile conflicting evidence. So the certain obstacles that we face in evaluating identity carefully are, first of all, haste. We're just not spending enough time on the research. Superficial research, blind acceptance of authorities, ignorance of potentially useful sources, conventional assumptions that don't apply to all situations, and starting with an intention to confirm a desired outcome. Clearly, if you don't allow enough time, if you don't look beyond the easiest material to acquire, if you don't know exactly where to look to find more evidence, you could very well overlook some important discrepancies that would lead you to question a particular relationship. The most dangerous obstacle is the last one in this list, however. Please don't approach your research with an agenda, because when you do that, you're probably going to accept everything that agrees with that agenda and discount or set aside material that calls it into question. We must start the journey not knowing where it's going to lead us. Maybe it's the allure of royalty. You might want to be related to a particular family or a particular individual for a lot of reasons. It could be that high status individual that's in that family that you want to be connected to, royalty or not. Maybe it's a notable family of status in a particular community, or just a person with a pretty cool, interesting life that you want so badly to be kin to. Maybe the researcher is just conditioned to accept a story that was handed down in the family, but which proves to be false or mostly false, like all those Addams families out there who claim to be related to the presidential family and are not. This is a situation in which an open mind, to belabor a point, becomes a necessity. Let's look at a second scenario, a theoretical one. Thomas Brown, a slave owner, dies in 1858. He leaves a will in which he names a slave, Hester, and her child Beatty to his daughter Rachel Tillman, the wife of Logan Tillman. In the same county after the Civil War, in 1870, we find a house headed by a freedman named Bill Parson, age 27, and his wife Obedience, age 25, and next door is an older black woman named Hester Brown, aged 50. Are these the Hester and Beatty of the Thomas Brown will? So far, it looks quite good. But how would we put that identification to the test? Well, the truth is we may never know for sure, but there are things that we can do to test this assumption. Did Obedience Parson name any children after Hester and her known kin? Did she name any children after the White family that we think may be connected? We can ask ourselves whether the freedmen are living near their assumed former master's property within the county. We can examine the later records of the White family after freedom to see if we can document any further association between these former slaves and Thomas Brown's descendants. Many associations that began during slavery continued after it ended. Then we might ask, did Obedience Parson live into the period when death certificates were kept? She very well could have, given her age. If so, will her death certificate tell us who her mother was? Is Hester Brown or Hester Parson listed as her mother on that record? Marriage licenses may exist which will list her parents as well if she got married in that period of the late 19th century or early 20th century, married again even. Did any of Obedience Parson's children leave records that would indicate what her maiden name was? Was it Brown, Tillman, or some other name that was associated with the prior owner of Hester? We can check the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules of the Parson and Brown families. Are there enslaved people of roughly the right age and the gender that we expect present? We can carefully examine any slave-related transactions associated with this Brown-Tillman family of slave owners. Is there more information about Beatty and Hester that can be potentially cross-referenced against those freedmen? Are there other potential mother-daughter connections in the neighborhood between former slaves named Esther and Beatty, or Hester and Obedience, which will fit the facts? And those have to be dealt with and sorted out before we can be very clear about the chances involved in making these affirmative statements. The more questions we can answer affirmatively, the more confirmed we can feel in this rather obvious but not foregone conclusion. When you encounter two people in the same family or just in the same county with an identical name, chances are that you are not the first one who wanted to avoid confusion. The officials in that place, or at that time, wanted to avoid it as well. Look for the distinctions that they use to separate one person from the other. Usually, record keepers will start applying monikers or nicknames to individuals once they reach the age of majority to keep them straight from one another. And this is much more the case with men than women, because men had public duties and obligations that women didn't have in the period of time we're talking about. They had more property rights that would need sorting out. So these nicknames often appear in court records particularly, or even tax records or census records. So you might find a person distinguished by occupation, as in Thomas Jones, bricklayer, or geography, Thomas Jones, Reedy Creek, the creek on which he lived. Physical characteristics, Thomas Jones, red, because he had red hair, or maybe a ruddy complexion. Relative age, Thomas Jones Jr. as opposed to senior, which doesn't necessarily mean that one was the son of the other. It could mean that one is just a little bit older than the other. Relationship, Thomas Jones of Margaret, so Thomas Jones, the son of Margaret. Or it could be race, Thomas Jones of color. Now, these nicknames can be extremely helpful, and they often are consistent across many years. Sometimes they provide important clues in and of themselves. For example, there are two John Coles who founded families in 18th century Richmond County, North Carolina. One of them is my ancestor. The other is not. They lived in different parts of the county. They were vastly different in wealth and influence, mine, of course, being the much poorer, more disreputable, but much more interesting family, in my opinion. But I acquired a beautiful clue when I read the early court minutes of that county. My ancestors, his name, he was always termed John Cole Maryland in the court records. The other John Cole was John Cole Cordwainer, which means a kind of shoemaker or leather maker, leather worker, and indicating his profession. I was the lucky one because I later found out that my ancestor had come, indeed, from Kent County, Maryland, and I was able to trace the family back another 3 generations and even further along the mother's side of the family to colonial New York. By the way, John Cole Jr., son of John Cole, Maryland, was sometimes known as John Cole Sandhills for the part of the county in which he lived in, which were sandy and less fertile than other parts of the county. Other ways to separate people of the same name are by their physical location within the county and by the names of those with whom they consistently seem to appear in the records. Neighbors and associates are clear markers of difference between same named individuals. Signatures are clearly wonderful markers of a person's identity, and usually quite consistent across time. The exception comes with physical decline in old age, mental or physical infirmity. If you can find a signature that you know is your ancestors and compare it against signatures of persons you believe to be identical with them, you don't need to be a handwriting expert to prove that they are the same. A wonderful example is Henry Lightfoot, who married Patsy Darnell in Wake County in 1802 in North Carolina, and then abandoned his family. Patsy sued for divorce, but by that time, Henry was long gone. A descendant from this first marriage believes she had found him in Kentucky shortly after marrying a second time and having a large family, even though he was technically still married to the first wife. His son by the first marriage later relocated to the same county in Arkansas where the children of the second marriage had settled. She used an early signature from Kentucky and compared it against the one on his bond in North Carolina, and they seemed entirely consistent. Another example is the one pictured on the slide. The signatures of John Gillum, an elusive character who lived at various times in Randolph, Chatham, and Moore counties in North Carolina between 1790 and 1810 and rarely appears in records. Now, we were able to document him and his son of the same name by using their signatures, but we had to look deep in the records to find them. The best places to find signatures are on petitions, in probate records like wills, bonds, receipts, marriage records as principals or bondsmen, in court records on bonds, witness testimony, commission reports, promissory notes. Also, a man who tends to sign his name regularly is probably not the same as a man who chooses to use a mark instead. But even marks, even if they are consistent, can sometimes be so distinctive as to suggest that 2 instances represent the same individual. Isaac Johnson, my ancestor, for example, used a mark that looked something like a leaning letter N. He used it repeatedly in his migration from Chatham County into Orange and Guilford counties between 1790 and 1800, and the clerks copied it faithfully when they recorded his deeds or deeds that he witnessed. Isaac Johnson is a very, very common name, but the mark was not so common. It helps me distinguish him from others of that same name in that community, including a nephew with his name. A very common identity issue involves trying to trace an individual to a point of origin from a location in which they later lived in life. Now, first you have to cast a wide net to find multiple plausible candidates in numerous other locations along established migration routes. Then you have to test to see whether each either fits or doesn't fit into the narrative of your ancestor's life, and whether there are indications that these individuals in other locations either stayed put, died there before your ancestor did, or moved somewhere else. If so, they cannot possibly be identical with the one that you're looking for. But you have to search for that particular evidence before coming to your conclusion, and it's not necessarily easy. I made one of the worst blunders in my genealogical career working on my Adams family in old Anson County, North Carolina, the part that became Richmond County in 1779, east of the Petey River. My third great-grandfather, Richard Adams, died in 1782, leaving a will. He had a wife named Amy and children named William, Thomas, James, Richard, Mary, and Betty. And he had slaves. He signed his will by Mark. He arrived in the county in the 1750s, just after it was formed. I thought I had this question all sewn up. I traced his earliest land transactions and found when he arrived in the county. I compiled a timeline for Richard Adams moving from a point of origin in Beaufort County, North Carolina, through Craven and Cumberland County, and leaving Cumberland just in time to show up in Anson. This Richard's father was named Abraham Adams of Beaufort County near Bath. Abraham died in, say, 1733 or early 1734, and his will mentions children named Abraham, Richard, William, Willoughby, and a daughter, Abiah. His wife was named Barthia. His son Abraham had a son named James Adams, who does seem to actually have come to early Anson County, though he didn't live near my Richard. But the ages were about right. The name Richard and William were repeated in my family. I thought I had the right group. I traced my ancestors here, supposed ancestors, all the way back to Norfolk County, Virginia. I put a lot of time and effort into that lineage. But other people were telling me that I was wrong. My peers in this family lineage, who knew as much or more than I did about it, said I should pay more attention to the given name Shockley, which was used repeatedly in several generations among descendants of our Richard Adams. Shockley was probably actually a surname converted into a given name, and it may have been Amy's maiden name. There were Shockleys on the border of Delaware and Maryland and Somerset and adjacent counties who lived near and interacted with a large Adams family in which the name Richard was very common. One Richard Adams from there had gone to Lunenburg County, Virginia. In an old quitrent list from the 1750s, he had 2 Shockley young men in his household for whom he paid head taxes. I had proved that that one couldn't be our Richard Adams because Lunenburg Richard later moved off to Henry County, Virginia, and died there, as did the Shockleys who lived with him. He was in Virginia the whole time that our Richard Adams was active in North Carolina, so I still believed that I was right. I had shared my findings through emails with various people. I had posted online about the connection on various message boards. I had a lot of skin in this game. But then I found the will that you see before you on the left in Richland District, South Carolina, near Columbia. It's for a different Richard Adams who died about 1787. When I started looking for them, I even found traditions that this Richard Adams has started out in the Petey region of North Carolina and moved to South Carolina later. So he did live in the vicinity of my Richard, but he did not remain there. Now, if you just look at the names that he gave his children, you instantly know that he is the same person as the son of Abraham of Beaufort County, North Carolina, named Richard. There are sons named William, James, John, Carroll, and Abraham, and a possible daughter named Anne Gregory. But the absolute clincher is a clause which states, I give John Carroll Adams and Richard Adams a tract of 320 acres of land in Blewford County, North Carolina. He spells it Blewford, B-L-E-W-F-O-R-D. He means Beaufort County. So there you have it, folks. Egg all over my face. I admitted that I was wrong when I found about this, but I think I've hurt some relationships long-term for persisting in that error and resisting the advice that others were giving me. A little later, I found a male Adams cousin descended from my Richard Adams of Richmond County who was willing to do a Y-DNA test, and he agreed, even paid for it himself. His results matched others from that Delaware-Maryland border area who had gone to the Midwest. So my critics were correct. I was wrong. We still don't have our precise lineage, but we do know where to look. So when you're trying to prove identity across a migration route, here are some things you can look for as consistency to help prove that 2 individuals in 2 different places are the same individual. A timeline that makes sense, including consonants in age and time of marriage, similar naming practices from one place to the other, associates who accompany an ancestor from one place to another, similar status and wealth between the two individuals across that migration route, the plausible historical circumstances that led to the migration, the migration itself making sense, that route, associates who accompany an ancestor from one place to another, examination and elimination of other possible candidates, signatures that align in one place and the second place, and then the DNA evidence that proves connections between that family and yours, which could be Y-DNA, it could even be autosomal DNA, if it's a little bit more recent, if it's from the early 1700s to the present and you have the right DNA. So while I'm in a mood to share my failures with you, let's look at a case I still haven't resolved, and I don't know that I ever will, or that anyone will. It's a very tormented situation that has been going on for well over a century now, with opposing parties on either side. This was the first royal lineage I thought I'd ever uncovered in my ancestry. So I was very excited, when I came across it, like a lot of people are. I wanted to believe it so badly. I even hand drew and decorated a large banner-sized chart showing all the steps back to various famous people in this line with drawings, an elaborate border, even coats of arms. I actually hung it on my wall, people, back when I was in my 20s in my apartment. That's how demented I became. This lineage would tie me back to such varied figures as early explorers of North America like Sir Fernando Gorges and Sir Walter Raleigh. His wife was a very close cousin of this line, Catherine Parr, the eighth and surviving wife of Henry VIII, and the very famous governor of colonial Virginia, William Berkeley, or Barclay rather. The royal line goes back through several strands to King Edward III, Edward I. Trace it back further, you hit connections with amazing people like the Rurikid princes of early medieval Russia, or Rus, Arpad rulers of Hungary, Bulgarian Khans, Byzantine emperors, William the Conqueror, and his rival for the English throne, Harold Godwinson. So to read about these people is one thing, and I was a big medieval history fan and still am. But to actually know and be able to trace a precise lineage to show that you actually descend from them can really turn nearly anybody's head. They tell us today that we're all descended from most people of prominence in early medieval times because at some point the number of our ancestors exceeds the number of people alive in that era of Western European history. But let's face it, for most of us, such theoretical connections will always be undocumented and unprovable. So I confess, with my interest in that history, I was seduced. Furthermore, this lineage has been endorsed by some very famous and important genealogists over the years. Fairfax Harrison in the early 20th century, John Bennett Body in the mid-century, and now most recently Douglas Richardson, the premier authority on American connections to royalty. They all have allowed that there was a good likelihood that William Norwood of Surry County, Virginia, was the same person as William Norwood, the son of Richard Norwood, Esquire, of Leckhampton Court in Gloucestershire. Richardson actually footnoted William of Surry County into his section on the Norwoods in his 5-volume royal ancestry set of just it was about 5 years ago now. I guess even an experienced genealogist could be forgiven for being swayed by endorsements on that level, but over time, I had begun to doubt. Maybe 7 years ago, I published an assessment of this claim and cited counter evidence. I think seeing the pros and cons for it could help you in your own assessments of whether two people are identical. First, it's important to state that only one contemporary record in England found to date has mentioned the son of Richard and Elizabeth Stewart Norwood of Leckhampton Court in Gloucestershire named William, and that was the Herald's Visitation of 1622, which listed the children in the family. No age is given for him, but we know that he must have been born before 1622, and later that his eldest surviving brother, he was born later than his eldest surviving brother Francis in 1603. Neither Richard nor Elizabeth had a will or an administration which detailed all of their heirs, because that's now not how inheritance works for the most part in England in these families. The eldest son, Francis, inherited the landed estates by primogeniture, where the oldest male inherits, though he nearly lost them for his loyalty to the king in the English civil wars of the 1640s. The parish registers of Leckhampton, they're missing for this period, and only bishops' transcripts for a few years within that period survive. There wasn't much need or occasion for the other children to appear in records. Nevertheless, I've conducted more detailed research on the British family looking for clues to what happened to William than anyone else. I've fleshed out the family tree, as you can see here. In that first slide, you could see it, mostly using chancery court cases filed in London. The family was highly litigious. They were in court a lot. There were conflicts among the siblings and among generations. There are some wills from later generations. Several siblings appear by name in litigation, but William never appears. So he could have died young, right? He could have died in the English Civil War. Did he go to Europe to fight in the Netherlands, like so many younger sons in this and other gentry families? And he could have died there. Did he go to America? That's also possible. Anything's possible. The family did have two first cousins, Henry and Charles Norwood, who did spend some time in Virginia, probably at the invitation of the Governor Berkeley that we were talking about earlier, who was their cousin. Now, Charles occupied a position of great prominence as the secretary to the House of Burgesses. Henry was the colony's treasurer, and so both of these men returned to England when the monarchy was restored. Neither had children. We can prove that the Richard Norwood family were royalists, as I said before, supporting the king, and they had both money and supplies that they were offering. William's brother Francis and his brother-in-law Richard Hanslip actually fought with the king. We can prove that. They were also recusants, which means that they were under scrutiny for being secret Catholics. Now we know that Richard, the father in the family, Richard Norwood, died in the 1630s with a lot of debt. The family only escaped losing its land to creditors due to the widow's jointure, Elizabeth Stewart Norwood. And that lasted until her death just a month or two before William Norwood first appears in Virginia. After that, it was only the redemption by a son-in-law, Richard Hanslip, that saved the property from confiscation. So if William Norwood migrated at this time, it would make perfect sense. With his mother's property under threat due to her imminent death, perhaps a secret Catholic himself and a royalist with no inheritance locally, it would have been time for William to move on. Virginia, where he had kin in positions of power, would be a likely place of refuge. We also know that when one family estate needed further administration during this period, that of Richard's brother Henry Norwood Sr., the next of kin appointed to do so was not one of Henry's sons, they were both in Virginia, or even his son-in-law, Mr. Bingham, who was a Commonwealth MP under the Oliver Cromwell regime, but it was one of Richard's granddaughters, Augustina Havard, who was a great niece. So that must mean there were no sons or nephews living or nearby who could carry out those duties. So likely they were all dead, abroad, or in hiding. We can in fact prove that a few of them did die during or before the Civil Wars. John and Thomas, sons of Richard, for example, died without issue, and we can prove that. But were there others? Now, there are some reasons to think that William of Surry County, Virginia, was the same as William of Leckhampton. One of these is age-related. William was exempted from taxation in Virginia due to age, beginning in 1682. That means that he was probably at least 60 years old at the time, and thus he was born before the visitation in 1622 that mentions the name of that other William Norwood, who could be the same. The Virginia William lived until 1704. By that time, he would have been at least 80 years old. Several members of the Lecampton family we know did live into old age, including both of William's grandfathers, who must have been in their 80s at death. That would be Nicholas Stewart and Henry Norwood. I'm sorry, William Norwood would have been the grandfather on the Norwood side. Longevity is a family trait, and it was rare in the 1600s, particularly in a frontier environment. So he had good genes, right? That would make us think, okay, possibly Virginia William is the William of Lecampton court. The availability of funds. There is nothing to indicate that William of Surrey was an indentured servant. He arrived around 1650 and he bought land immediately. So where did he get the money for passage and to set himself up? Well, if he was William of Lecampton, he would have had a sizable inheritance from his maternal grandfather, Nicholas Stewart, Doctor of Law in the neighboring county of Hampshire. He left each grandchild about 66 pounds. And in today's money, that's about 8,184 pounds. That was enough to get to America in 1650 and begin your life. A few amenities that we found in William Norwood of Surrey County, Virginia's household. At his death, William Norwood owned several pieces of silver, a cup, and some spoons, which he left to his children. So if he were William of Lecampton, the family could have given him several pieces of silver to carry on his sojourn in America and use it for funds if needed. So household silver was portable wealth, and it was relatively rare in 17th century Virginia. So that's in his favor. Naming practices. Well, William did name sons Richard, Edward, and William, and a daughter Elizabeth, and those are names in his family in Lecampton Court, if that is his family. But they're fairly common English names. He did not use any of the unusual names in this family, Augustine, Francis, Nicholas. If he had, we would have far less doubt about his identity. Status. What was the status of Surrey County, Virginia William? Well, in America, William was a friend of Colonel George Jordan, who was Attorney General for the colony at one time. Norwood was also a neighbor of Jordan. William Norwood named a son for Colonel Jordan. The Jordans gave the Norwoods land, free. Lydia Norwood, William's wife, was present at the deathbed of Madam Mary Harrison Sidway, the wife of the first Benjamin Harrison in America in Surrey County, and she signed that will as a witness. That is the dying woman, Mary Sidway, was the ancestor to a governor of Virginia, a speaker of the House of Burgesses, and 2 United States presidents. About 40% of the occasions on which William Norwood appears in the titleables lists of Surrey County, and there are a lot of those lists, the title Mr. is added to his name. Mr. was an honorific at the time reserved for county officials, lawyers, gentry, vestrymen. Militia officers, on the other hand, would use their military titles. But Norwood never held a county office of any kind. Why was he given the dignity of Mr. when so many in that list, most of the people in that list, were not given that? But there are other considerations which call into question William Norwood's identification with the Lecampton family. Norwood was a person of moderate wealth in Virginia. He never owned the thousands of acres that someone from a background like his, if it is the correct background, would typically accumulate. He had only about 500 acres at the most, and only about 180 when he died. He never held any offices. He did have a couple of enslaved people and several white servants across his lifetime. If he was a first cousin of William Berkeley, the governor, however, one would expect him to rise quite high in the world. That's one problem. Secondly, on numerous occasions, it's documented that Norwood used a mark rather than a full signature. Now, if he was a Lecampton Norwood, there's zero chance that he was illiterate. These marks occur early in his life, so it wasn't because he was old that he was using a mark and blind or something. If he was William of Lecampton, the only way I can think to explain this is some kind of physical infirmity, maybe having lost his sight or an arm in the wars, and it made it difficult for him to sign his name. But that's a guess. If that did happen, maybe it also explains why he didn't have that much property, because he couldn't manage it as well as he could if he were completely abled at the time. Y-DNA testing of male descendants shows of the Surrey William Norwood shows matches with the ancestor of a family that settled in 17th century Massachusetts named William Dixon. Now, how did he end up with the same Y signature as the Virginia Norwoods? There were no Dixons living near Leckhampton Court in Gloucestershire. The Dixons are said to have come from Yorkshire. That has become less of a problem recently because we've discovered that through Big Y, that the connection between the Dixons and Norwoods may go back to the 15th century. It could be that early that they had a common ancestor, even as surnames were being adopted for the first time. So that may not be as much of an objection as it was before. And then I found an alternative Captain William Norwood, who is definitely associated with the Leckhampton family, who was a soldier in the Netherlands near Maastricht in 1670s. He died there. He left a will filed in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, leaving his property to Colonel Henry Norwood and his sister Jane Bingham. Since none of the siblings in Henry Norwood's family had children, I had to ask myself, who was this William? Could he be Leckhampton William? And then also, finally, I found alternative William Norwoods in the West Midlands with similar family given names and similar ages who could be our William. No one had ever studied them before. In fact, in spite of the fact that a book on the Norwoods in England claimed that the woman had looked at every Norwood she possibly could, she obviously overlooked these. So I thought in the end that these concerns were all very dire, particularly the soldier in the wars against Louis XIV in the Netherlands. Who was that Captain William Norwood? I felt sure that he was the William Norwood listed in the 1622 visitation. And so I published that. I put that in writing into my conclusions in a part of a larger article about doing research in England. I found out afterwards, however, by searching foreign archives online, something very different. The Dutch archives are important here. And I found that the William Norwood who died there had an alternative will, not the one filed at Canterbury in England. And that I also found that his father's will was in the Netherlands. And also a court case contesting his property was recorded there. These identified his father and his mother and his half-siblings. He was the son of another member of this family that I hadn't even thought about. He was the son of Ralph Norwood, the brother to Richard and Henry Norwood, who was a long-time soldier in the Netherlands from the early 1600s. So that half-Dutch William Norwood was simply following his father's career as a professional soldier, and he was not the William of the visitation at all. So the conclusion here is that I'm still confused. I don't understand why William Norwood in Virginia used a mark. I don't understand why he didn't rise to the level that I expect him to. I can't quite reconcile myself that he is identical to Leckhampton William. Unless we dig up the bones of those English ancestors and get their Y DNA and it matches the DNA of the American cousins, I'm just not sure I'm ever going to feel good about it, aside from finding a document. So the test of identity goes on and on and on. There is a possibility of getting some Y DNA. The problem is that the main line of the Norwood family from Leckhampton through Reverend Thomas Norwood, they continued to own that property into the early 1800s, but the male line died out. But I did find out through all my court case investigations that Reverend Thomas Norwood, had some brothers in England who sued him in the 1690s for their right to inherit Leckhampton because Thomas was not the oldest son. He was left the property by his cousin, who didn't have any heirs, and that defied the primogeniture rule. So there was a case made against him on that basis. And the case was appealed all the way to the House of Lords, and evidently it was decided in Thomas's favor. But there are those other sons, so what happened to them, those older sons in that family? They might have left issue. Maybe some male lineage does still exist today in England, although it's kind of a frail chance. So I need to look more carefully at those cases so that I can find those families and maybe trace a male descendant to test. So the lesson to take away here is very simple. Two people of the same name in the same location, or two different locations, are very often not to be confused with one another. Finding out whether they are the same person requires careful and deep inquiry and an openness to evidence that may contradict a cherished theory. It takes an assemblage of correlated and convincing evidence from many sources to achieve assurance that identity has been proven. Usually that evidence exists if we will but look for it. Sometimes, however, it is quite a struggle, and we may have to live with some uncertainty, but better not to make unequivocal claims that later fall through. If you're not sure, use conditional language in how you state something so that you won't mislead others, as I've done. One more little point before I finish, and that is, it is so common to see people in the 17th century and the 18th century in family trees given middle names, like John Thomas Conway, for example. And I just want to state that before the early 1800s, it was so uncommon for anyone to have a middle name. Now, I don't say that no one had a middle name in the 1700s, much less likely they would have one in the 1600s. But the ones who do have a middle name, they're usually not both given names. Usually that middle name is a family name that is used to commemorate an ancestor on the female side of the family. And they're usually very wealthy people who have those names. But if you see someone with two given names that are pure given names, first and middle, in the 1700s or the 1600s, that is usually someone trying to confuse two individuals that have very different names and make them one person. And that should be a big marker that someone has made an identity mistake. All right, with that, I bid you farewell. Good luck in your research, but keep in mind the confusions and potential pitfalls of identity.